That's called the hot zone, where the explosions and fires are. We're in the cold zone, where people have been decontaminated, and we're starting the IVs, doing the airways, those kinds of things. So don't be heroes. Follow your community's chain of command. And nurses, do what you know how to do best, and that's treating those patients with the expertise that you have. There's a saying that for every nurse who goes down, gets injured, or is in someplace not safe or protected, there are 50 patients who cannot be helped.
Clock in, scrub up, and join us behind the red line. You're listening to First Case, a perioperative podcast bringing you exciting interviews, engaging discussions, and innovative solutions that are changing the way patients receive surgical care. Each episode, we talk to frontline staff, perioperative leadership, and nursing entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the back table to the boardroom, from wheels in to wheels out, we tackle the real-life issues affecting the OR. Whether you're tuning in for surgical service education or inspiration, we're glad you're here. And now it's time to roll back and start the first case.
Today, we're speaking with Dr. Joanne Langan, professor at St. Louis University, Valentine School of Nursing. And Chris, in the last episode, we talked about our own experiences and shared a little bit of why we care so much about the topic of disaster preparedness. And I think that was a great segue into this conversation with Dr. Langan because she had something really big motivate her as well.
And she is such a resource for the not just nursing in general, but also I wish that I had had the textbooks that she is going to talk about for, our trainings that we talked about last episode, because it can be utilized in a hospital, in a university system, and in the general public too. I can't wait for everybody to hear what she has to say.
Oh yeah, she's got lots of good stuff and you will be blown away, I promise. And you will leave with things that you want to take back to your department and talk about. And all of it is really good stuff. So don't go anywhere. We will be right back with Dr. Joanne Langan.
Hi, I'm Chris Blevins.
And I'm Melanie Perry.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to First Case.
Welcome to this week's episode of First Case. Today we are speaking with Dr. Joanne Langan, professor at St. Louis University Valentine School of Nursing. And Joanne, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
I'm so excited to start this conversation with you today. And fun fact, Lindsay Joyce, who is part of our team here at First Case, for all of you listening, she actually works with Joanne at St. Louis University. And when I told Lindsay that we were doing a season on disaster preparedness, she immediately said, "You have got to talk to Joanne. She is your expert." And so I am so glad for that connection and happy that she connected us. And I am really looking forward to our conversation today. But before we dive into all of that, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to everyone?
Well, I first got interested in disaster preparedness, response, and recovery after 9/11, 2001. And our dean of the School of Nursing at the time had a faculty meeting and said, "What are you nurse faculty doing to prepare our staff, students, and faculty?" We didn't have an answer. So we had an individual who was our oldest BSN graduate, Elsie Roth, who contacted the university development person and said, "You know what? I know people in Israel who are experts in disaster preparedness at the Hadassah Medical Center and nursing school. Would you be interested in sending a group to Israel to study, to learn from them?" And of course, we jumped right on it. So there were a team of 5 of us who got to study for about 10 days. And we learned so much from the nurses, the doctors, families, of deceased survivors. It was an incredible experience. But before we even went on the trip, I said, we were hearing from the nurses, some of their stories. And I said, we've got to write a textbook because this is cutting edge stuff. And all nurses need to know these basic competencies. So that was the genesis of the first book that we published in 2005. And my more recent textbook is published in 2023.
So in general, even before, you got to go into Israel and you had that connection, just 9/11 was so devastating for all of us. And I know that you all as a university wanted to be prepared for disasters, but I guess, where did your mind go? Were you specifically thinking terrorism? What kinds of disasters was the university trying to prepare itself for in general?
Great question. Yes, at the time we were thinking terrorism, but we are in the Midwest and we get many, many tornadoes. We get severe winter storms. We get severe summer storms, and most of them result in loss of power. And then we also get flooding. So then we have all the infectious diseases that are associated with that, the boil, water orders, that kind of thing. And we knew nurses are so trusted in the community that we knew that nurses had to have this information to better teach our patients, people in our community. So we had to have the information, which we did not have. We had basic public health principles, which many of us taught, but we needed more detail. So yeah, it was about terrorism, but what really people relate to are the natural disasters that sometimes are predicted, sometimes not.
Especially in this day and age, right? You don't know what's coming around or even what season it is. Yeah, no kidding. Oh.
You kind of whetted my appetite when you were talking about how you used your resources and connections in Israel to expand your knowledge and to really take what other people had learned so that you could apply it to our healthcare providers here in the States. But what was it that you learned from them? What were they teaching you while you were over there?
Well, even thinking about it just gives me chills because we learned about decontamination and how they have decontamination corridors that are both elevated, where they have hoses that come down to shower masses of people. They have hoses built into the ground where there's a cap or a lid on it, where you flip that open and you pull the hoses out to decontaminate. People in the ED taught us that they paint a yellow line across the parking lot. And that yellow line is a demarcation between clean and contaminated. So, for instance, if a healthcare provider would go to the other side of that yellow line to provide healthcare services, trauma relief, whatever it is, starting an IV, where the people are contaminated, they may not come back across that yellow line to go back to the ED. They had individuals in place at that yellow demarcation line that said you cannot come back into the hospital until you, healthcare provider, are decontaminated. They also had people on the roof of the hospitals that watched the flow of traffic so that they could have a good control of who came, because with mass casualty incidents, you get overwhelmed very quickly. So they had to have traffic control and security. We learned about the security looking at our supplies of antidotes. If there's a nerve agent, we have tractor trailers that bring in our supplies of antidotes, IV fluids. Those tractor trailers have to be protected from pirates who want to get their hands on the medications, the antidotes, the IV fluids that are finally going to be in scarce supply because of the high demand. So these were things we didn't even think about.
Well, and then I would think also you'd have to worry about the security of the healthcare providers themselves, right? Because you don't know in those situations the people that are needing care, even which side they're on, or, are they the pirates themselves? I mean,
You're exactly right.
Oh.
And the huge ethical dilemma is often you don't know if the individuals coming in, the survivors with these wounds and just traumatic wounds, if it's a perpetrator or if it's a victim, an innocent victim. So they taught us everyone gets treated the same. If they're coming into our hospital, we as nurses in the day to day, we don't know if we're treating a criminal or not. Everyone gets treated the same. They could be a dignitary, doesn't matter. They all get that same of care and compassion. So that was huge. And taking care of basic thing I tell students is take care of yourselves first so that you can take care of others.
Oh, that's a great...
Do not go into a burning building. We have professionals who are trained how to go into a burning building and save lives. That's not our job.
Right.
Our job, that's called the hot zone, where the explosions and fires are. We're in the cold zone, where people have been decontaminated, and we're starting the IVs, doing the airways, those kinds of things. So don't be heroes. Follow your community's chain of command. And nurses, do what you know how to do best, and that's treating those patients with the expertise that you have. There's a saying that for every nurse who goes down, gets injured, or is in someplace not safe or protected, there are 50 patients who cannot be helped.
Oh my goodness.
Those
Wow.
statistics are
that
scary.
That is incredible. I know statistics can be scary. So, I'm thinking about what you're saying about the things that you learned in Israel, and even a cursory glance at current events will tell you that Israel has a lot of just volatile history and things that go on just constantly over there. And so these are people with the experience, with the training, and honestly just a constant readiness because you don't know what's going to happen. So I can see how they would be very valuable educators for you to go over there to learn from them and then bring that back. So when you sat under them and learned and probably thought about things you've never thought about before. How did you take all of that and then apply it not only to your university setting, but also to healthcare?
Interesting. We did a lot since then.
Big question.
Right. We have written textbooks. We have created learning modules, and we've gotten grant money to disseminate that information to a wide variety. We have traveled locally, nationally, internationally to share that knowledge with nurses and healthcare providers on a wide range of topics. So we try to find out what is the most likely. We do a hazard vulnerability assessment. What kind of hazards are most likely in a given area where we go to speak? And that's where we concentrate our efforts, because that's what they're really going to listen to. However, we tell them an all hazards preparation is thinking about all possible events that could happen in a community. And that does include the terrorism as well.
Sure. So in any of these areas, right, there are certain standards and there are certain basic steps that you have to follow, right? So what are those core kind of competencies in disaster nursing that you train, regardless of what in the world has happened in that area?
I'm so glad you asked that question.
Well, thank you, Joanne.
The International Council of Nurses has created a disaster nursing primer, I would almost call it. It lists all the competencies that new graduate nurses need to know. That's a level 1. And then there are like supervisory nurses, another level of competencies that nurses need to know. But then the third level that just came out most recently is for nurses who deploy to areas where they've experienced disasters. That's another great level. On the basic level, for all nurses to need to know, they need to do their own preparation and planning. What have you done to prepare your family when you're separated? Who's going to be that third party outside of your area who maybe hasn't experienced what you're going through? Who everyone else can contact to check on your well-being? So your own personal preparedness. Communication. If all of the landlines go down. You think you can rely on your cell phones? Maybe, maybe not.
Probably not.
But
yeah.
Texting in many cases has been our go-to. We have walkie-talkies and we have ham radios and different forms of communication that reassuringly our city planners and our disaster planners are way ahead of us. They have that, and our government system has that communication in line. They're prepared. Incident management has to do with, are you the first nurse to recognize a trend in signs and symptoms that patients are presenting with? You could then become the incident commander to say, wait a minute, if they're saturated with a fluid substance and their eyes are burning, their skin's burning, chemical, keep them out of that ED, keep them out of the hospital, stop them in their tracks. So these are some basic things. Safety and security. Again, you're not going into that burning building. Assessment is huge. Every nurse knows how to do that. So basic skills are to assess, is this something that I can handle with a first aid kit? Or do I need to elevate whatever they're coming in with or coming to my home with in the community, in the school, in an ambulatory care setting? Intervention has to do with critical thinking. What can you as a nurse do to intervene in this situation to keep something from exacerbating into something more difficult? And then nurses help in the recovery phase. They may even volunteer at an American Red Cross shelter area using nurses' excellent expertise, knowledge, and competence to help people who are in a shelter. And then with law and ethics, thinking about how we're going to provide the most service and resources to the most amount of people, that utilitarian principle. But when we have mass casualty events, we do what's called reverse triage. And that means with limited resources, we have to help first those who are the most able and the most survivable. And those who would require the most amount of resources, knowledge, supplies, we are sorry, but they have to wait because we want to do the greatest good for the greatest number.
So earlier in this season, we talked some about my experience as a community emergency response member in it was the medical liaison. And so a lot of what you talked about was great because, sometimes nurses are in short supply. And so a lot of that training that you all provide can be spread to the greater community and can be utilized in these situations. And so the books that you all have written can really be used to help other community members and those people that are wanting to do good and just don't know how to do the most good in these situations, which can be quite scary, right?
Our main message is awareness. We can't remain in our little silos or our specialty areas. And I tell the students all the time, you might be a NICU nurse and you are excellent taking care of those sick babies. But don't think that you're going to hide there. If there's a mass casualty event, you may be called in. You may be at home. You're not even scheduled to work. You may be called in. Neighbors may be asking you, do we really have to pay attention to this? And they're relying on you to have that information and correct information and dispel any kind of rumors that are going. Give them the correct information.
So I think too, we educate and we start with that training of just, heck, I would love to take a class and just learn about all of these core competencies and do some real self-evaluation as to what do I know and what do I not know, right? But then it has to go beyond that, right? We have to maybe train regularly or continue our education so that we are always ready. So is there a cadence to training and preparedness that we should be looking at so that we are staying ready?
Well, our CPR cards are valid for 2 years, right?
Yeah.
I think that's a problem.
True. Yes.
I have, if you don't practice it, it's gone. I mean, yes, I'm sorry. Ventilations, compressions, what's that ratio? But I have heard of many hospitals offering that CPR renewal every quarter. And I think that's brilliant because not all specialty areas use the code, CPR. So I think too, with the disaster preparedness, it needs to be in the annual competencies of every nurse, regardless of practice setting. There has to be some kind of centralized testing area, and not to ever point the finger, you didn't know or you didn't pass this. No, it's a learning experience. If you don't know, how can I learn about it? So think about school nurses. They're out there. They're working autonomously. They don't have a staff to support them. Our best support is in the hospital, so you can always ask somebody, but ambulatory care sites, people who work out in the community, home visiting, it would be great if they could have this knowledge and know when they need to escalate a situation up to supervisory level or somebody in disaster planning, police, fire in their communities.
Yeah. I think of a couple of different instances at my own facility. I remember one time, and it's something as simple as, a code in the operating room is not something that we announce overhead. We're not calling a rapid response team. We're dealing with it within our own ORs, but there are still ways of communicating that there's a problem and that we need to get our attending anesthesia or other people in the room. And the way that this particular ORs were set up is the anesthesia provider had a alarm bell button on their monitor. And it was a simple thing. You just clicked it and it automatically told anesthesia that, hey, we need help. Come on, and then, the circulator would call the charge nurse and all, it's kind of the normal progression of things. But in this particular instance, the CRNA was already dealing with a crashing patient. She couldn't let go and go push the buttons on her monitor, and she needed the nurse to come over there and push it, but the nurse didn't know. Like, we had not been told that there was this button on the monitor or that we could even find it on our computer screen. And the tiniest little bit of information that suddenly, if it's included in your regular training or it's pointed out to you, so now suddenly when you're panicked because there's a problem, you're not fumbling around like, I don't know what we're talking about. Like, I can see it, in my own experience with a very bad situation at my facility in the middle of that crisis and trauma, my thoughts were very jumbled and disoriented because I didn't really know what I was doing. I'd never been in a situation like that. But then also my fear of, am I doing the right thing? Am I going to get in trouble because I did something wrong? And in that moment, when there are lives to be saved, my concern should not be whether or not I'm going to get in trouble later because I didn't do it right. And so I think you're very right in saying that if we train people so that they already know, we can take that fear out so we can just act and we can just do.
It needs to be auto mode. When it comes to reacting to an emergency, it needs to be automatic. What we have learned through our research with nurse executives who have been through these traumatic events in the hospital settings, you have to have hands-on training. You have to know, how do you work that med sled? How do you package that person up in the med sled so they're comfortable going down 5 flights of stairs? Right. You can't use the elevator. No. You got to get your hands on that. You either need to be in that med sled as a patient to experience what that feels like, or you need to be seeing, this is really heavy. We need to have enough people to do this. We know that hands-on training, those lessons and concepts will stick. To simply have a conversation or disseminate something online and say, read this, it's not going to cut it. You've got to get your hands on. You know how it is with the CPR and codes. If you got to set up the crash cart, you need to know where everything is and you need to know yesterday. So people have to get their hands on it. Please get it into orientations for new nurses, new hires, and just run through these things. There's no blame. It's all learning. As soon as you start blaming, like errors in med errors in healthcare delivery, nursing, if there's too much punishment, what happens? They don't get reported. Mm-hmm. So if we say, okay, it's probably a system error, let's see how we can avoid this in the future. So if we approach everything as a learning opportunity, that no blame, let's work together. And maybe I, as the supervisor, didn't give you enough education or the hands-on or show you where that was. How can I expect you to know in an instant when this happens. The ethical part is huge too. That has to be taught, discussed, decided, policy, procedure before an event. So if you have to make decisions, who gets the event, who doesn't, that has to be, whatever the algorithm is, has to be in place, because we as individual nurses want to save everybody,
Right.
but we can't. So if that stuff is in place and we feel confident that we can go through this algorithm and make the correct choices to do, again, the best for the most, it offers a little bit of comfort. There's no comfort in disaster, none. But if you feel like you've been prepared and you did the best that you could at that point in time, you're going to cry about it later and over. That's obvious. But to know that you did the best that you could any given day, any nurse, if they feel that he or she has done the best they've done during their time there, that's comforting. Maybe you can sleep at night. But boy, if there's one error you wish that you could have avoided, or just something more you could have done, that eats away at us. So
it does. Yes, it
let's
does.
try to avoid that and just provide the education, the training, the hands-on, and just talk it out. And it's got to be on a regular basis. It has to be scheduled.
Well, so Dr. Langan, speaking of all this reflection and, wanting to make sure that we're doing the right thing, your time in Israel, especially with the decontamination and the processes and all that you learned, I wonder how that prepped you, because it was pre-pandemic. How did all of those lessons in disaster preparation prepare you all to deal with the pandemic in your area during COVID?
Well, during the pandemic, I'm still in the education realm, and we had to pivot from on-site education to online. But so many of us as nurse faculty got into every immunization clinic that we could. And we were giving hundreds of immunizations a day. And that was so rewarding, because that was something we could do. As far as jumping into the hospital and taking care of intensive care patients in the OR, no. But we supported all of you
Absolutely.
in the community and immunized people so that they could get back to work. And it's just the PPE, personal protective equipment, was just so huge. And we have a strategic national stockpile, which I'm sure we all went through several times. There's a fine line between having all of this equipment and medicines and everything stockpiled, and then they expire. And then it has to either be put to use, or those expired things have to be discarded, and it's a huge amount of money. So if we could put things into place and use them and then replenish, that would be a cost savings if we can actually use those items. But
Right.
It was a dilemma.
Did people, I'm sure, because of your expertise, though, in disaster planning and preparation, did other people in the community look to you or for your department for advice, for recommendation, or for your expertise so they could implement other plans?
Well, one of the biggest things was, should I get this vaccination or not?
Right.
Do I really need to wear a face mask?
Right.
Do I really need to wipe off my mail and the packages that have come to my front door?
Or my groceries?
Yeah. And we're like, we don't know. Clean it.
Yeah.
Wipe it.
Yeah.
Antiseptic, whatever you have to do. Until we know and we have more information, we're just going to those extremes because we don't know. As we learned, we were able to ease up somewhat. I'm just saying the emotional trauma, the psych mental health of the whole situation was huge. It's huge in every situation. I would be remiss unless I talked about the emotional health of nurses, healthcare providers, psychological trauma that is so real for first responders, fire, police, healthcare providers during a disaster, because it's huge. We talk about debriefing. In Israel, they said it's mandatory. Everybody has to come, whether you speak or not. It doesn't matter. But you're going to hear people express what you're feeling. It just validates what you're feeling. And whether you come 2, 3, 5 times or for the next 5 years, it's up to you. But we want you to hear what other people are feeling so that you can feel like, I'm not crazy. Everybody's feeling this, and it just takes time. And that's the thing. People have to be given, they have to forgive themselves, but they also have to be forgiven if they need more time off and just kind of walk off the case, walk out of that area, and just take a break. And what's tough with our administrators is then backfilling for people. But people are not doing their best care when they're hurting and they can't focus.
I can 100% agree. I know that we had mandatory debriefing after we had a shooting at work, and we had to, you didn't have to talk, but you did have to listen. And, the hospital was fantastic with providing support for us afterwards. And therapy dogs, I can't say enough things about therapy dogs. They're fantastic. But just in general, the care and concern that was shown for us. But yeah, at some point, it's like, well, we still have people who need help, who have that psychological injury that needs to be addressed, but we still have patients to see, and we still have work to do, and our department has to keep going and finding ways to balance that. But you're so right that we have to recognize that moral injury or that psychological injury that our employees are dealing with during the disaster, and that it, just because the disaster is over doesn't mean that they're automatically better. And I know that in my own life, I was not better for a long time. I think sometimes I'm still not better, but I'm better than I was, And so like to think about how long it takes to heal from some of these very unexpected disasters or unexpected events, it takes longer than just the next day.
It's not
people
finite.
Forget that sometimes.
We cannot put a date and time on it. The research I've done 4 and 5 years after events, when I do the interviews and or focus groups and these individuals start talking about their experience, it's like it happened yesterday, because it all comes flooding back. But it's cathartic for them to talk about it. Just like we learned when we were learning about disaster preparedness recovery, is the parents who had children who were killed by a terrorist bomber, suicide bomber. They said, please talk to us about our loved ones who died. And they said, people say to them, we don't want to talk about it because we're going to make you cry. And they said, we cry every day.
Yeah, whether you want us to or not, right?
Don't forget our loved ones.
Don't forget.
Bring it up, right. Mention them, and you'll know if we want to talk more about it, but don't forget to mention our loved ones, because it's not like they never existed. They're with us every day. So if there's trauma that people have gone through, they want that. The ones we learned from said they do want to talk about, but do be sensitive to how much in depth. Let that person who's been injured lead that discussion, and they might say, thank you for thinking of me. Thank you for thinking of my deceased loved one, but we're doing okay, and we'd like to move on. And how are you doing?
Sure. Well, and I love that you even said that, because trauma isn't just experienced by one side, right? Like, we are all experiencing this disaster, whether it's the victim or the caregiver. We all need to be able to give each other grace and go through it together. And on that note, good grief, we're out of time again, which Melanie and I constantly say. These amazing conversations go by so quickly, but you teach all of us nurses, those of us who are not nurses, we can all use this information and do good in the OR, outside of the OR, in the hospital and outside of the hospital. But I wanted to give you a chance to give us any final thoughts. How can we best prepare for the disaster that's unknown? Because it's not, if it happens, but when. We'd love to give you that opportunity.
When we first started this journey after 9/11, it was cutting edge. Now there is so much out available to the public, and free modules and just free learning opportunities that nurses can get their hands on. Healthcare providers, staff, everybody, hospital preparedness plans, FEMA, CDC. Go to those major websites. There's so much there to teach not only staff, nurses, doctors, everybody in the community. But what I wanted you all to know as OR nurses, the very special perioperative area, is to have the conversation and practice a drill. If a shooter would come into your area, how do you secure your area? And all the special considerations with the oxygen and all the gases and everything you're dealing with, the electricity and static and all of that. How do you secure your area? And you as the nurse, are you going to protect yourself so that you can take care of others later? Or are you going to stay there with your patient who is not conscious?
That is a whole other episode.
Maybe that patient gets shot or you as the nurse get shot. So it's just talk about the possibilities and what would we do. But the main thing is, how do you secure your area so that someone who's there to do ill doesn't even get access?
That's a great question.
Oh, wow. That is a great question, and a great question to leave the conversation on, because it's very applicable to our departments, because our departments are so specific and so closed off and so unique. And yet we have to think through that specifically for ourselves, for our departments. How do we do that? What does it look like? That's really good food for thought, and just a really good conversation starter personally. So please, if you're listening, take this question back and have this conversation with your department. How would you be ready? How would you prepare? And what would you do? Dr. Langan, I cannot thank you enough for joining us today, for giving up your time and sharing your expertise with us. I have learned so much in our conversations, and I'm so thankful that you were willing to join us today.
It's been wonderful.
Very welcome. My pleasure. You know, I teach a whole semester disaster preparedness front of course, so I could just talk and talk, but I think we hit on some really fine, prominent thoughts, and I appreciate being invited.
Yes, ma'am.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. That was Dr. Joanne Langan, professor at St. Louis University Valentine School of Nursing. And Chris, I am literally blown away at the depth of thought and preparation that she has put into her training and to her focus on being ready. And honestly, I really think it's cool that 9/11 was the starting place. Not that 9/11 was a good thing, because it certainly wasn't, but to see something like this, something that is really good, come out of it is very encouraging to see a good after something so bad, you know?
Yeah, and you can just hear her passion, and it is a tool that can be used for generation upon generation upon generation. And you've seen it adapted, not just for terrorism, but then also for a pandemic. And, you know, unfortunately, disasters are going to continue to happen. And for this to be a tool to be continued to use and maybe save lives, she's definitely an inspiration to not just nurses, but to all of us who just want to do a little good.
Yeah, absolutely. And those core competencies that she mentioned are free. We're going to include them with our social media posts so that you can access those core competencies and read them, learn them, and then hopefully apply them to your own practice. That is going to do it for this week's episode. We still have so much more to come, so stay tuned. On behalf of Chris, Lindsay Joyce, myself, and the whole team here at First Case, thanks for listening to this week's podcast.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of First Case. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to First Case on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on iPhone or Android. Simply search for First Case in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@firstcasemedia.com. We look forward to hearing from you.